So I wanted, before we get started, to let everyone know that I have a new podcast out, and it's called Meditations. If you like the Meditations segment of this current podcast, you'll like the Meditations podcast. It's nothing but 20 minutes of meditative sounds. And now, on with the podcast.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
Went on one date with this little guy, and we went to Ripley's Aquarium.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Jordan Peterson Thursday, June the 26th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the headlines, patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, and Jordan Peterson. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now the headlines for Thursday, June the 26th. Breaking. The Trump administration says it will limit the classified information given to Congress. LA Police Union demands resignation of local official who allegedly incited gangs against ICE. Attorney General Pam Bondi slams Senator Jeff Merkley. The foreign influence on America I would be concerned with if I were you is the Mexican national that resided in Oregon who was just arrested with 384 pounds of methamphetamine. Breaking. Miami Mayor Francis Suarez calls for a total ban on communists becoming citizens or holding public office. Breaking. An absolutely massive operation is underway as ICE, in coordination with FBI, ATF, and the DEA, have surrounded a fire equipment manufacturer in North Carolina. In the city of Stratford, Canada, a parade is held every first Sunday in April, accompanied by bagpipes and drums to lead swans that have been kept indoors during the winter out onto the water. Breaking. The White House is aggressively tracking down the person who leaked classified documents to CNN, per Carolyn Levitt. Starting tomorrow, the aesthetic nightmare that is hashtags will be banned from ads on X. Breaking. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stares right at the press and goes scorched earth. Just in, border czar Tom Homan sends a strong message to Zoran Mamdani after the mayoral candidate says he'll ban ICE from NYC. Quote, good luck with that. ICE is going to triple down. Federal law trumps state law every day, every hour, every minute, unquote. And those are the headlines for Thursday, June the 26th. Thank you. Now, Jeffrey Mead.
Where rent-stabilized apartments are actually stabilized.
So that is Zoran Mamdani. He just won the Democratic primary for mayor of New York City. And he's talking about stabilizing the rent. In other words, like freezing the rent. So them telling you how much you can charge for the properties that you own. By the way, New York City already has rent stabilization. Over 1 million apartments in New York City are already stabilized. Yet the city still has sky-high prices, long wait list, and crumbling buildings and deferred maintenance. Stabilizing prices actually deters new construction. Telling developers that they might be forced to stabilize prices is essentially a death sentence for supply. And here's one of the reasons why. So in 2024, for stabilized units, the rent increase cap was 2.75%, meaning you cannot increase the price of your rent on a one-year lease more than 2.75% higher than what it currently is. But here's the thing. In 2024, the operating cost on average for landlords increased by 12%. That's the average. So your operating costs go up by 12%, but you can only raise your prices by like 2.5% to 3%. Those numbers don't make sense for people who actually want to make money. So what happens? It hurts the quality of housing. It becomes harder and harder for owners to be able to pay for maintenance because they can't raise their prices to keep up with their cost. There's also no financial incentive to renovate properties. Because in a typical market, you can renovate your property and then you can charge more for it. When they control how much you can raise your rents, that incentive gets destroyed. So then you end up with dilapidated buildings and crappy buildings that tenants don't want to live in. So to keep it simple, it disincentivizes people from building new housing, while also disincentivizing people to renovate properties because, again, they can't charge more for them, by also making it harder for owners to actually be able to afford the maintenance that is required.
And that was Jeffrey Mead. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the patriotic short.
The initial call came for a troops in contact. It was a Marine and ANA team. Together, they were on patrol, started taking fire, and one had been hit and was critically injured. We take turns going into the zone, which bird's going to land, sometimes depending on patient needs, but mostly just, each mission, it gives one bird time in the zone and practice, and also it gives the other bird time doing overwatch and kind of mentally helps with both aspects so you're not constantly under fire or in the hot zone. It was our time as lead to go in. And by the time we got there, we had gotten word that there were 2 other patients. So that made 3 critically injured patients. I immediately made the call to give it to the trail bird because they had 3 PJs on board. So it was better patient care. 2, I could have handled. 3, it's just better, 1 patient per PJ. So we became the overwatch bird. And as we came into the zone and called for the smoke on the ground, they popped it. We popped up over that smoke to draw any fire that there might be because it's a big thing for them to be able to take down the rescue birds, and it worked like a charm. We drew their fire. They started shooting up at us, and as we were engaging back down on them, a lucky round came, bounced off the door, and went down through both of my legs. I didn't realize that it was a bullet at first. I really thought a flare, because we have flares on the helicopter that pop off, whether we're engaged by rockets or sometimes they pop off if we go over a really hot heat source like a campfire and we're flying really low. So I thought a flare had hit me in the leg. So I made that call over the radio. I said, I think a flare just hit me in the leg. And my team leader said, really? And I said, yeah. And as I looked, that's when all my musculature and everything moved, and that's where I felt the pain. I called back over the radio, said I'm hit. That's a very calm way of saying it. There was a lot more yelling involved, manly yelling. But I pulled myself back in the helicopter, ripped off my tourniquet, my crow, put the tourniquet off on my left leg, and then he put his own tourniquet on my right leg. And pretty much I was dosed with a great amount of ketamine and had a great ride back to Bastion.
And that was the Patriotic Short. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, motivation.
Don't even use the word commit. Don't even think about the word discipline. Just do the thing every single day, whether you feel like it or not. Your only commitment is to the activity, not to the grand scheme, not to the big picture, not to the implications of what it is that you're doing. It's to do the thing. Habits are the building blocks of our lives, not the goals or the grand schemes or the vision or the big idea. It's what you can do every single day that matters more than anything. Develop good habits that will carry you through to having a very successful life.
There are 2 types of people in the world. There are those who fight the uncomfortable and those who can face the uncomfortable.
What makes you comfortable can ruin you. Or what makes you uncomfortable is the only way to grow.
Nothing great comes from a position of comfort. Safety, comfort zones are dead zones. You have to continue to push yourself.
Yes, we're tired. Yes, we're hungry. Yes, the mind is saying give up. Yes, it's saying quit. But we cannot quit because we realize we have not reached the goal yet. This is not what I dreamed about. This is not what I said I was going to do. This is not what it looks like. I got to squeeze. And then once we get past that place, we become comfortable with being uncomfortable. We no longer thrive to be in the comfort zone.
Nothing worthwhile is easy to get. And if you can get used to being uncomfortable, your limits are non-existent. You're either moving forward or standing still. The choice is yours. Hesitation allows the moment to pass, the opportunity to be lost, the enemy to get the upper hand. Hesitation defeats us, so we must defeat it. To win, all you have to do is overcome that moment, the waiting. And to do that, all you have to do is go. Move. Take the action. Get out of bed. Get your feet on the ground. Step forward. Do not wait. Go forward and win. I will make every day, every minute, every second, I will make it all count. Get after it, and you will become the person you want to be. And you become that person through one small decision at a time.
I want to win so bad. My hunger
An appetite for success is intimidating. It scares the shit out of people. And people around me say, slow down. Stop. You're doing too much. Your appetite is too big. I can't help myself. I want to win. You have to be relentless. You have to never let off the gas, never stop, never quit. Never allow anyone to talk you out of the dream, the vision, and ideas that God has sent you. Everybody laughed at me. Everybody was looking at me like, man, you just gonna leave your city to go seek a dream and seek something that you're passionate about? Absolutely. Absolutely. Do what you have to do. You gotta grind and hustle and get out of your familiar space and walk boldly into the unfamiliar so that blessings and opportunities can present itself. If it's a game of survival, we're going to get from where we are to where we try to be.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
Words can't be unsaid. Better to trip with the feet than with the tongue. Zeno, quoted in Diogenes Laertius. Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, 7.1.26. You can always get up after you fall, but remember, what has been said can never be unsaid, especially cruel and hurtful things.
And that was the Daily Stoic. And now, His Excellency, Bishop Robert Barron.
What do you hunger and thirst for? I'm hungry and thirsty for success, for power, for bodily pleasure. You'll be happy if you hunger and thirst for one thing, righteousness. That means doing the will of God. Again, think about this now. When you get out of bed in the morning, ask yourself that question. What do you want? If you're super honest, you'll uncover some of these attachments. Well, deep down, what I want is to be a big worldly success. What I want deep down through all these things is for everybody to like me. Okay, that's the way we sinners think. You want to be holy, happy, hunger and thirst for righteousness.
And that was His Excellency, Bishop Robert Barron. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, "There's an air of impoverished drabness, of tired routine, of stagnant monotony in all of our cultural activities. From stage to screen, to literature and the arts, to the allegedly intellectual publications and discussions. There's nothing to see or to hear. Everything produces the effect of déjà vu or déjà entendu. How long since you've read anything startling, different, fresh, unexpected?" Unquote. That was Ayn Rand from the chapter The Establishing of an Establishment, from the book Philosophy, Who Needs It? Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Sanchez.
La alta representante, para entendernos coloquialmente, la ministra de Asuntos Exteriores a nivel europeo, lo que era antes Josep Borrell, pues se hizo eco de un informe del relator de derechos humanos donde hablaba de que Israel podía estar violando el artículo 2 del acuerdo de asociación que tiene la Unión Europea con Israel relativo al respeto a los derechos humanos. Creo que es más que evidente que Israel está violando ese artículo 2 y por tanto lo que defenderé hoy en el Consejo Europeo es que Europa tiene que suspender el acuerdo de asociación con Israel y tiene que hacerlo inmediatamente, porque lo que no tiene ningún sentido es que llevemos 18 paquetes de sanciones a Rusia por su agresión a Ucrania y Europa, en un doble estándar, no sea capaz ni de suspender un acuerdo de asociación cuando se está violando flagrantemente el artículo 2 del respeto a los derechos humanos por parte de este caso.
And that was Sanchez. Back in a minute. Thank you, Stu Varney.
Welcome back. We are about 30 minutes away from the opening bell sounding for a Thursday. We've got a market that is holding on to gains. Dow Industrial's up about 104. Mark, let me get you some final thoughts here, as we did get some economic data out this morning, which was mixed. GDP worse than expected. Jobless claims better than expected. Your thoughts?
Yeah, the GDP number, I'm still not overly concerned about that. It's kind of an outlier quarter, given the fact that our net exports were so low because we imported so much in advance of tariffs. But just some real quick common sense thoughts on rent controls. For anyone that doesn't know, rent controls, while some might think that's a good thing, it's awful. What they do is it will lead to less supply because builders no longer want to build housing that isn't profitable, and it leads to lower quality housing as well. Why? Why would a builder want to invest in their property if they know they can't make any money? So it's not a good thing.
I don't understand why the candidate for New York City thinks that it's okay not to pay your bills.
Yeah. Sounds like socialism, doesn't it? And that really didn't work out for Cuba or Venezuela, Maria. And by the way, our current mayor, Eric Adams, he was on Fox and Friends yesterday. Then he came back to the building yesterday and he sat down with the editorial board at the New York Post. And he laid out his vision for the city. He's going to run on safety, security. He's going to have a press conference today at noon. There's 1 million unregistered, unaffiliated voters in the city. 1 million. You only had a few 100,000 that voted in that primary. So stand by. And also Adams is depending on Cuomo to step aside. We'll see.
We'll see about that. All right, Mark Tepper, Cheryl Cassoni, thank you. Don't miss my interview with President Trump, my exclusive in the middle of all of this. I'll be sitting down with the president for a Sunday Morning Futures exclusive on Fox News on Sunday, but we will have more Monday's program right here on Fox Business. Have a great day, everybody. Varney and Company picks it up. Stu, take it away.
Hi, good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. The administration is responding forcefully to the leaked report that the Iran strike was less than successful. The CIA says not true. It would take years for the Iranians to rebuild. And about an hour ago, Defense Secretary Hegseth revealed more intelligence that the nuclear facilities were obliterated. The chair of the Joint Chiefs has a detailed look at the brilliant military operation. You are going to see it. The administration has launched an investigation. If they find the leaker, he or she will go to jail, and the administration will limit the classified information it reveals to Congress. Separately, Ayatollah Khomeini has surfaced. Nobody's heard from him for about a week. But on X this morning, he says, quote, with all that commotion and all those claims, the Zionist regime was practically knocked out and crushed under the blows of the Islamic Republic. President Trump says there will be a meeting with Iran next week. We don't know where it'll take place or who our team will meet with. To the markets, and investors still believe that the Iran strike was a win. Separately, the economy contracted at an annual rate of 0.5% in the first quarter. That's not having much impact on the market. The Dow up 100 points. That's pre-market action. And the Nasdaq's up about 82. Nvidia, that stock's up another 2%, is it? Yeah, 1.1% at the moment. After their annual shareholder meeting, they're playing up robotics, and investors like it. Little change for the price of oil. We're looking at $65 a barrel this morning. The price of gold coming in at $3,336 per ounce, down about $6. Interest rates at lower levels. The yield on the 10-year Treasury, look at that, down to 4.27%. The 2-year, 3.75%, both yields down. On the show today, President Trump is considering naming the next chair of the Federal Reserve. That's his way of putting pressure on Powell, who must leave in May of next year. The president demands an immediate rate cut. The Democrats are unnerved by Zoran Mamdani, the socialist who may be the next mayor of New York. They fear a generational change of leadership that will introduce election-losing policies. Prominent Democrat Larry Summers says, I'm profoundly alarmed about the future of the Democrat Party and the country. We're going to take a close look at the fake news leak that supposedly showed only limited success for the Iran strike. We'll look at CNN, the network which broke the so-called story. Why is the media so quick to try and make Trump look bad? Thursday, June 26th, 2025.
And that was a little bit of Maria and a lot of Stu. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, what does the phrase, if you're explaining you're losing, mean in debates? This was said by Ronald Reagan, speaking of political campaigns. From the perspective of your audience, if you have to explain yourself, you come off looking desperate to convince. As a consequence, you lose the high ground. From a more philosophical perspective, when you have a clear conscience and strong conviction towards the positions you take, your values, truth, and direction, you don't need the opinions or consent of others. As a consequence, you don't need to explain yourself. However, if you yourself are not convinced of the validity and truth of your position, or you can't fully justify your choices, then you continue to expel words in an attempt to create the illusion of certainty. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now this is a little bit clip of my buddy, or not so buddy, let's see, Bill O'Reilly, I'm sorry. And he's talking about the mission on Saturday. But there's a little clip right here that you got to hear.
So, Cortez, I don't know where Kasten is here. So Kasten is the congressman from Illinois, and he and Cortez, while American pilots were still in the mission, in the skies, called for the impeachment of Donald Trump on Saturday night, while they were doing that. Now, I researched it. If this had been a declared war, those two congresspeople would have been charged with treason. Which you can't.
There you go. Just what I'm talking about, been talking about. If you're going to commit troops to battle, get a declaration of war. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bill O'Reilly again. This is going to be a little example of gaslighting. Bill getting gaslit.
Let's go to the mail. We have Robert D. Benedetto, Augusta, Georgia. Tell me if I'm wrong, Bill, about the ceasefire. I know it's impossible to predict, but I'd like to know what your gut feeling is. Mine's telling me that terrorists, like leopards, cannot change their spots. I believe President Trump is a peacemaker and is hopeful, but he's fooling himself. That kind of analysis gets us nowhere. I don't have gut.
Okay, so notice what the guy did when he sent in the email. Hello, Bill O'Reilly. So he's cordial, and that sets up this email. But he doesn't he doesn't identify himself. Who is he? Is he a Trump fan? Is he a Trump hater? Is he a Republican? Is he a Democrat? Is he a conservative? Is he a liberal? And then again with the hi Bill, how are you? It's nice and cordial, so it can lead Mr. O'Reilly into thinking that this guy is one of his fans, perhaps a conservative, maybe a Trump supporter, and that he's just legitimately confused. But what if that's not the case? What if this guy is Sammy Socialist, and he's calling or sending in his email in this particular case in order to subvert Bill's program, in order to gaslight him, so that Bill, no matter how he answers the question, is going to be wrong and confused. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now from a book that's called Good Inside. What's the opposite of understanding? For this argument's sake, it's convincing. Convincing is the attempt to prove a singular reality, to prove that only one thing is true. Convincing is an attempt to be right, and as a result make the other person wrong. It rests on the assumption that there's only one correct viewpoint. And then my question is this supposed to be convincing? Further, convincing has one goal in mind, being right. And here's the unfortunate consequence of being right. The other person feels unseen and unheard, at which point most people become infuriated and combative, because it feels as if the other person does not accept your realness or worth. Feeling unseen and unheard makes connection impossible. Understanding two things are true and convincing one thing is true are diametrically opposed ways of approaching other people, so a powerful first step in any interaction is to notice which mode you're in. When you're in one thing is true mode, you're judgmental of and reactive to someone else's experience because it feels like an assault on your own truth. As a result, you will seek to prove your own point of view, which in turn makes the other person defensive because they need to uphold the realness of their experience. In One Thing is True mode, exchanges escalate quickly. Each person thinks they're arguing about the content of the conversation when in fact they're trying to defend that they are a real, worthy person with a real, truthful experience. And again, is this convincing? Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit of law and order and another example of determinism in action.
The black man in America is estranged from society. He's been taught in school that he's equal, yet he cannot help but realize that he's different.
And what is the source of those feelings, Doctor?
History. First selling the black man into bondage, then America prospering on the backs of black laborers, and then a changing technology usurping the need for physical labor. It often leads to feelings of uselessness and isolation, which in turn leads to self-hatred. Unfortunately, it's very common.
And how does this self-hatred show itself?
Well, eventually it's redirected outward toward their tormentors. Some individuals can't help but lash out at the symbols of their torment.
In this case, Wallace Holbrook.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, so there you go. You have where she's saying that he is powerless, that the defendant who is on trial for murder is powerless, that he is forced to do the things he does by powers beyond his control. Leads to. She also started this whole thing by suggesting, not saying, but suggesting that all black men have certain psychological traits, that all black men feel the same way or have been victimized in exactly the same way. She didn't say some black men. That might be accurate, but suggesting that all of them, now we get into determinism. People are forced to do what they do by powers beyond their control. In this case, racism. And it's wrong. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of law and order, and the initial person that you heard that was asking the questions was the defense attorney. Now, you heard him say thank you, so he finished with his questioning of a particular witness. She's an expert witness. And now, the district attorney or assistant district attorney is going to go ahead and cross-examine the witness, and he's on the right track, but not quite. Here.
What about Holocaust survivors, Doctor, or Cambodian refugees or Soviet dissidents? They were persecuted. Are they also entitled to kill their bosses?
You can't equate the history of blacks in America with that of the Jews or Cambodians or Soviets. They weren't brought here in chains. Their children weren't sold.
I see. So that makes black men less capable of exercising self-control.
That is the very attitude that feeds the racism in this country.
Yes, Doctor. And it's you who are giving all the bigots in this country the justification for their fear and hatred.
Objection. Okay, so what he did was, and I was anticipating an objection there from the defense because he made a statement instead of asking a question. But anyways, so he says what he should have done here was go right after the determinism issue, because that's all racism, like accusations of racism and saying we are a racist society and all this is based on determinism, that people have no free will, forced to do what they do by powers beyond their control. So what he should have done was challenge her on that. Say, so nobody has free will. See what she says. And if she goes along with that, then what is it about Cambodians and other people? Do they have free will too? Then are they then justified? And if they are, why haven't they murdered their bosses? But go right after determinism, because that's the philosophical underpinning of her arguments. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Back in a minute. Thank you, and now Europe 1.
Évoqué hier votre dispositif pour l'été, on a trouvé que c'était un dispositif très masculin. Le prof de sport, le nutritionniste. Donc, on a beaucoup parlé.
On a brainstormé.
Les trois mousquetaires qui étaient 4, donc nous sommes 4, et on s'est dit, on va faire quelque chose pour Cyril. Donc, on a fait un recrutement avec un casting sous le haut patronage et l'autorité de Fabien. On s'est dit, donc, il y a une personne qui va intégrer votre dispositif estival, qui va apporter un peu de douceur, un peu de charme, un peu de sensualité, et elle est venue vous rencontrer, puisque le casting a été assuré par nos soins.
Alors, elle est là?
Oui. La personne
elle est où? Elle est où? Elle est là. Alors, c'est Daniel Moreau, ça, c'est sûr.
Pas du tout.
Elle arrive, non. Si. C'est qui?
Attendez,
Et d'après moi, on a coché tous vos critères.
La porte est ouverte.
Attention,
sortez Laval. La porte s'ouvre. Les mecs, qui va arriver?
Comme c'est les affaires de coco.
Qui va arriver?
Ouais, c'est les affaires de coco, ouais.
Un peu de douceur, un peu de sévérité.
Emmène-moi dans le studio.
Emmène-moi danser ce soir.
Toi, là. Non, mais c'est rien. Non, mais ils ont ramené Raymond américain.
Elle est dégueulasse. Alors, je tiens à demander quelque chose.
And that was Europe 1. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Jordan Peterson.
Not in a careless, bitter way, but in a deeply conscious and resolute way. That kind of moment is not anger. It's not vengeance. It's clarity. Empathy is often misunderstood in our culture. It's typically portrayed as softness, as a form of gentle acquiescence to the emotional needs of others. And while empathy does involve a deep capacity to understand and resonate with another person's emotions, that capacity doesn't imply weakness. In fact, true empathy is one of the most powerful traits a human being can possess, because it requires courage, discipline, and extraordinary self-awareness. When we talk about empathy in the context of narcissistic dynamics, we're not talking about a superficial trait. We're talking about someone who can feel deeply, someone who can understand not just what another person is expressing on the surface, but what they are really experiencing underneath. An empath doesn't just hear words, they perceive meaning. They sense patterns, emotions, motives. This is a form of psychological intuition that many mistake for emotional vulnerability. But it isn't vulnerability, not inherently. It's insight. It's intelligence wrapped in compassion. Now, here's where the dynamic becomes particularly interesting. Narcissists, by their nature, are not interested in mutual understanding. They are not operating on the same emotional frequency. Their world is constructed around control, attention, and ego preservation. To them, the empath is not a person. They're a resource, a mirror, a tool that reflects back the validation the narcissist craves. So when an empath enters their life, it feels like a perfect match on the surface. The narcissist thrives on admiration, and the empath is naturally inclined to give support, to nurture, to understand. But underneath this dynamic lies a dangerous imbalance. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And that's where the distinction lies. An empath who has not yet awakened to their own power, to their own right to say no, becomes easy prey to narcissistic manipulation. Their compassion gets weaponized against them. Their desire to help becomes a leash around their soul. They start to doubt themselves. They begin to internalize the narcissist narrative. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. This gaslighting corrodes the empath's sense of reality. They try harder. They give more. They sacrifice themselves to preserve the illusion of connection. But here's the truth that changes everything. Empathy is only powerful when it is conscious, when it is aware of its own worth, when it is no longer operating on autopilot, trying to earn love or fix the unfixable. That is when empathy transforms from passive sensitivity into active strength. It becomes selective, discerning, intentional. And that's what makes it dangerous to the narcissist. Because a self-aware empath begins to see through the narcissist's game. They stop reacting emotionally to every manipulation. They stop explaining themselves, justifying themselves, defending their reality. They stop carrying the guilt that was never theirs. And most importantly, they stop trying to save someone who does not want to be saved. They realize that compassion does not mean martyrdom, that love without respect is not love, it's servitude. And they begin to redirect that empathy inward toward themselves. That is the moment when everything changes, when empathy evolves from reactive caregiving into empowered sovereignty. And that shift is terrifying to the narcissist, because the empath is no longer a predictable source of supply. They no longer soothe the narcissist's wounds or validate their inflated self-immunion. They become unpredictable, calm, silent, detached. And in the narcissist world, that's the ultimate threat. Because the narcissist cannot control someone who is no longer emotionally entangled with them. Empathy at its highest form requires strength. It requires the strength to feel everything without losing yourself in the process, to see clearly without denying the truth, to care deeply without surrendering your boundaries. This kind of empathy is forged in fire. It's earned through pain. It doesn't come from naivety or passivity. It comes from walking through the dark night of emotional abuse and coming out the other side with your identity intact. Narcissists operate from a fundamentally different psychological framework than most people understand. At their core, they are driven not by logic or reason, but by emotional manipulation and control. They create a world in which they are the center, the authority, and the victim all at once. To maintain this illusion, they must surround themselves with people who reflect back their desired image. People who validate them continuously. People who comply emotionally. That's the foundation of their power. Not truth, not reason, but compliance. And that compliance is emotional, not intellectual. You cannot argue with a narcissist and win, because the argument is never really about the topic at hand. It's about control. It's about shifting blame, about distorting reality to maintain their sense of superiority or victimhood. They don't debate to understand. They debate to dominate. They don't listen to hear, they listen to gather ammunition. In these dynamics, logic becomes irrelevant. You can present the clearest facts, the most reasonable explanations, and it will all be twisted, deflected, or ignored, because what the narcissist fears most is not your facts, it's your emotional independence. This is why empaths are so valuable to them. An empath brings not only deep emotional attunement, but also a willingness to see the best in others, to give the benefit of the doubt, to empathize even when it hurts. That is a gift in healthy relationships. But in a relationship with a narcissist, it becomes the very thing used against the empath. The narcissist senses this early on. They test it. They see how much the empath will tolerate, how quickly they apologize, how far they'll bend. And once they realize that emotional compliance is available, they exploit it fully. Over time, the empath is drawn into a cycle of emotional confusion. They find themselves defending actions they never took, apologizing for reactions they never had, and questioning their own memories. They begin to doubt their instincts, their perceptions, even their identity. This erosion of self is not accidental. It is the narcissist's unspoken strategy. The more emotionally unstable and uncertain the empath becomes, the more power the narcissist has. It's not about logic. It never was. It's about keeping the empath emotionally entangled, perpetually off balance. That's the key. Narcissists do not want to resolve conflict. They want to perpetuate it, not openly, but covertly. They want just enough chaos to keep the empath reactive, emotionally invested, and constantly trying to fix things. The more the empath invests emotionally, the more the narcissist feeds off of that energy, and the more they escalate behaviors, gaslighting, projection, blame shifting. The more the empath tries to understand, tries to soothe, tries to explain. But again, the narcissist isn't looking for understanding. They are looking for submission. They are looking for control masked as conversation. Many empaths are intelligent, thoughtful, even highly self-aware. But intelligence doesn't protect against emotional entrapment, because the trap isn't laid in logic, it's laid in emotional conditioning. The narcissist conditions the empath to associate peace with compliance, love with self-sacrifice, and connection with chaos. Over time, the empath begins to anticipate the narcissist's reactions. They edit their words, their tone, even their behavior to avoid conflict. And in doing so, they slowly lose touch with their own emotional reality. The narcissist has succeeded not by winning an argument, but by creating a world where the empath doubts their right to feel what they feel. This emotional dependency is precisely why narcissists can maintain control even when their logic is obviously flawed. They don't have to be right, they just have to make the empath feel wrong. They don't have to tell the truth, they just have to make the empath feel guilty. The moment the empath accepts the role of emotional caretaker in a one-sided relationship, the narcissist has all the power they need. Because they're not relying on truth, they're relying on emotional reflexes, on guilt, on hope, on fear. The only way to break this cycle is not through explanation, not through confrontation, not even through evidence. It's through emotional detachment. Because when the empath no longer feels the need to prove, to explain, to please, the narcissist's tactics lose their grip. That is the point at which the game begins to fall apart. The narcissist cannot survive in an emotionally neutral environment. They cannot manipulate a person who is no longer reacting. They cannot dominate someone who no longer internalizes their chaos. Boundaries are often misunderstood, especially by those who have spent their lives prioritizing the emotions and needs of others. For an empath, the idea of setting a boundary can initially feel like a betrayal of their core values, compassion, openness, and connection. But in reality, boundaries are not walls that keep people out. They are the lines that define where the self begins and ends. And for an empath, learning to draw those lines is the beginning of awakening to their true power. In relationships with narcissists, boundaries are the first thing to be tested, pushed, and ultimately violated. Narcissists operate through entitlement. They believe they are owed attention, validation, admiration, and control over how others perceive them. When an empath enters the picture, they are often met with charm, affection, and an illusion of emotional intimacy. The narcissist quickly identifies the empath's natural tendencies to care deeply, to listen, and to avoid conflict. These traits are then exploited to slowly dismantle the empath's sense of personal space and identity. The erosion of boundaries in this dynamic is often subtle. It doesn't begin with overt abuse. It begins with small compromises, ignoring a red flag, excusing a cruel comment, allowing a bit of disrespect because they're just having a bad day. The empath rationalizes these moments because they believe in growth, in a second chances, in understanding the pain of others, but each concession becomes a step away from the self. Over time, the empath finds themselves making excuses for the narcissist's behavior, prioritizing their moods and sacrificing their own needs to maintain peace. What makes this dynamic so damaging is that it masquerades as love. The narcissist frames the empath's resistance as selfishness, their boundaries as cruelty, their independence as betrayal. They condition the empath to feel guilty for asserting themselves. They twist boundaries into rejection. This emotional inversion keeps the empath stuck in a cycle of self-doubt and overcompensation. The more they try to reestablish themselves, the more resistance they face. It becomes easier to surrender than to fight for clarity. But awakening comes when the empath finally sees the cost of this surrender, when the exhaustion becomes unbearable, when the self-betrayal becomes too loud to ignore. The empath begins to question not only the narcissist, but the entire framework of the relationship. They begin to ask new questions. What do I need? What do I feel? What is no longer acceptable to me? These questions mark the beginning of transformation because they are the foundation upon which boundaries are built. Setting boundaries is not a reaction to the narcissist. It is a declaration of self-worth. It's the moment the empath stops defining themselves by what they give and starts recognizing who they are. A boundary is not about changing the narcissist's behavior. It's about choosing what you will no longer allow in your life. It's not about control, it's about clarity. Clarity about what serves you, what honors you, and what protects your peace. When an empath begins to set boundaries, the narcissist often reacts with fury, confusion, or manipulation. They are not used to resistance. They are not used to hearing no. That word threatens their illusion of control. It disrupts the emotional economy they've created, where the empath gives endlessly and they take without question. A boundary exposes this imbalance. It forces the narcissist to confront a reality they've spent their lives avoiding, that other people exist as separate, autonomous beings. This confrontation is uncomfortable, and the narcissist will often escalate their behavior to regain control. They may try to guilt trip the empath, play the victim, or suddenly shift to love bombing in an attempt to restore the previous dynamic. But once the empath has felt the strength of their own boundaries, something irreversible happens. They begin to see the pattern. They start to trust their instincts over the narcissist's narrative. They no longer feel responsible for another person's emotional regulation. And most importantly, they realize they are allowed to take up space, to have needs, to say no without explanation or apology. Boundaries are not just limits. They are declarations of identity. They are the architecture of self-respect. For the empath, they represent a radical shift from external validation to internal alignment. They mark the transition from emotional servitude to personal sovereignty. And while they may initially bring conflict, they ultimately bring clarity, peace, and freedom. Detachment is often misunderstood, especially by those who have been conditioned to associate love with sacrifice, attention with care, and presence with obligation. For empaths, detachment may initially feel cold or even cruel. They are used to being emotionally available, constantly present, and deeply invested in the well-being of others. However, when faced with a narcissistic dynamic, this emotional presence becomes a liability rather than a strength. In the hands of a narcissist, every emotional reaction becomes a point of leverage, every vulnerability an opportunity for control. The more reactive the empath is, the more power the narcissist holds. Narcissists thrive in emotionally charged environments. They rely on confusion, volatility, and intensity to maintain control. The constant highs and lows they create keep the empath in a state of emotional survival, always trying to fix, soothe, or understand. They draw the empath into a psychological game where the rules constantly change and the goalposts endlessly shift. It is not logic that traps the empath, but their own emotional investment. The more they care, the more entangled they become. The more they explain themselves, the deeper they sink. And all the while, the narcissist feeds on the attention, the apologies, the pleas for clarity. In this context, detachment becomes a radical act of self-preservation. It is not an act of indifference, but a decision to stop engaging in a system that is designed to keep them emotionally captive. Detachment is the refusal to participate in manipulation, the refusal to be drawn into false narratives or manufactured crises. It is the moment when the empath stops reacting, stops defending, stops explaining. And this shift dismantles the narcissist's entire strategy. Where once there was argument, there is now silence. Where once there was justification, there is now stillness. The narcissist is no longer receiving the emotional feedback they rely on to feel powerful and in control. They may escalate, provoke, or even beg to regain that dynamic, but detachment is not easily reversed once it is truly embraced. The empath no longer needs to win the argument, clarify the misunderstanding, or earn the narcissist's approval. They understand that there is nothing to prove and nothing to fix. The game only continues as long as they choose to play. Detachment also reveals the emotional patterns that were previously invisible. From the outside, it becomes clear how predictable the narcissist's tactics really are. The cycles of love bombing, devaluation, and discard lose their mystique. The promises and apologies begin to sound like scripts. The charm no longer feels genuine. And perhaps most powerfully, the empath realizes that they no longer need to decipher or decode the narcissist's behavior. They begin to understand that it is not their responsibility to understand or carry someone else's dysfunction. This realization is deeply liberating. It allows the empath to reclaim their emotional energy and redirect it inward. Instead of investing in someone else's healing, they begin to invest in their own. They develop new boundaries, rediscover forgotten interests, and reconnect with their inner voice. Detachment creates space for reflection, for truth, and for clarity. It is in that space that the empath begins to feel a sense of peace they may not have known was possible. The narcissist, on the other hand, is destabilized by this change. They are no longer the center of attention. They no longer have control over the empath's emotions. They may respond with rage, desperation, or even calculated charm to reestablish the connection. But the empath, now grounded in detachment, sees through these efforts. They no longer feel the need to rescue, to absorb, or to engage. Their sense of self is no longer tied to the narcissist's approval or rejection. Detachment does not mean a lack of empathy. It means recognizing that empathy can exist without emotional entanglement. It is the awareness that you can care about someone without sacrificing your well-being. It is the understanding that love, if it requires the destruction of the self, is not love at all. For the empath, detachment is a return to emotional sovereignty. It is the process of stepping out of the narcissist's shadow and back into the light of their own truth. Healing is not just about moving on. It's about reclaiming parts of yourself that were lost in the process of trying to love someone who could not or would not reciprocate in a healthy way. For the empath who has endured a relationship with a narcissist, healing becomes a revolutionary act. It is the gradual unraveling of all the false beliefs that were instilled through manipulation, emotional abuse, and psychological control. It's the slow, painful process of remembering who you were before your identity was shaped around another person's dysfunction. Narcissists operate through control. Not just overt control, like telling someone what to do, but subtle, insidious control that chips away at self-trust and autonomy. They rewrite reality through gaslighting, distort the narrative through projection, and reframe their cruelty as your fault. Over time, the empath internalizes these distortions. They begin to question their own motives, doubt their memory, and suppress their emotions. They adapt to survive, often losing the ability to differentiate between love and obligation, kindness and compliance, compassion and codependence. But when the empath steps away from the relationship, physically or emotionally, the healing process begins to illuminate all that was hidden in plain sight. Patterns that once seemed confusing start to make sense. The cycles of abuse that were normalized begin to look grotesque in retrospect. The constant emotional exhaustion, the hypervigilance, the chronic guilt, it all starts to connect. The empath begins to see that the problem was never their love, but the lack of mutual respect and reciprocity. They realize that being emotionally generous in a one-sided dynamic is not noble, it's self-destructive. Healing breaks the narcissist's psychological hold because it signifies a complete withdrawal from the game they were playing. The narcissist thrives on attention, emotional reactions, and the ability to influence how others feel and behave. When the empath begins to heal, they stop providing that fuel. They stop answering the late-night messages, stop explaining themselves, stop seeking closure from someone who was never capable of giving it. They stop needing the narcissist to validate their experience or acknowledge the harm done. This shift is devastating to the narcissist because it disrupts the illusion of control. They can no longer reach into the empath's emotional world and stir chaos. The empath is no longer available to be triggered, manipulated, or guilt-tripped. And because narcissists rarely self-reflect, they often interpret this emotional unavailability as betrayal or punishment, never realizing that it is actually self-preservation. The empath is not playing hard to get. They are truly gone, emotionally and spiritually. As the empath heals, they begin to rebuild their identity. They learn to listen to their inner voice again. They practice saying no without guilt. They reclaim joy in solitude and strength and boundaries. They start to form new connections, ones based on mutual respect and emotional safety. Their world becomes less about surviving and more about living. The scars remain, but they no longer define the empath's sense of self. They serve as reminders of resilience, not of failure. In this process, the empath also comes to understand that healing is not linear. There are moments of clarity followed by moments of grief. There are days when the weight of the past feels overwhelming and days when freedom feels exhilarating. But each step, no matter how small, is a movement toward wholeness. And with each step, the narcissist's influence fades. Their voice, once so loud in the empath's mind, begins to lose power. Their opinions no longer dictate self-worth. Their approval no longer feels necessary. Healing also brings about a new level of discernment. The empath becomes better equipped to recognize red flags, to trust their intuition, and to walk away from dynamics that feel familiar in unhealthy ways. They no longer mistake chaos for passion or manipulation for love. They learn to distinguish between emotional availability and emotional dependency. They choose peace over intensity, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over temporary validation. This evolution is irreversible. Once the empath sees the truth, they cannot unsee it. Once they taste the strength of self-trust, they cannot go back to self-abandonment. The narcissist, who once held so much psychological influence, becomes just another person with no power over their emotions or identity. Healing transforms the empath from a source of supply into a sovereign being, someone who has reclaimed their autonomy, their voice, and their life. There comes a moment in every empath journey when the silence speaks louder than words, when the absence of reaction becomes the most powerful response. That moment, the moment of walking away without explanation, without pleading, without one last conversation, is the beginning of true liberation. For the narcissist, this silence is incomprehensible. They are accustomed to chaos, to drama, to emotionally charged exits that leave the door open for re-entry. They expect the empath to cry, to beg, to explain themselves one more time. But when the empath has truly had enough, there is no show, no final scene, only a quiet exit that carries more weight than any confrontation ever could. Narcissists operate within cycles, and those cycles are predictable. Idealize, devalue, discard, hoover. This pattern is not random, it's engineered. Each phase keeps the empath entangled, hoping that this time it will be different, that this time they will be understood. The narcissist knows how to bait that hope, how to offer just enough validation to keep the empath emotionally invested. But once the empath awakens to the cycle, once they stop hoping, stop trying, stop explaining, they break the loop. And nothing threatens the narcissist more than a loop that cannot close. Walking away is not just physical distance, it's emotional and psychological separation. It's no longer needing closure, no longer analyzing the narcissist's behavior, no longer taking responsibility for their dysfunction. It's not an act of bitterness, but of clarity. The empath has finally realized that nothing will change, that no apology will be sincere, that no explanation will ever make the abuse make sense. They stop seeking understanding from a person who was never interested in being understood. And in doing so, they reclaim their peace. This kind of departure hits differently. Narcissists thrive on unfinished business. They like the door cracked open, a thread they can pull on later. But when the empath walks away clean, when they disengage entirely and without emotion, it sends a message the narcissist cannot manipulate. I see you, I understand, and I'm done. There's nothing left to debate, no emotional leverage left to exploit. The narcissist, who once thrived on the empath's reactions, now finds themselves standing in silence, powerless. The power in this moment does not come from revenge or superiority. It comes from healing. The empath no longer walks away out of desperation or pain. They walk away because they've reconnected with their own value. They no longer need to prove that they were mistreated, no longer need the narcissist to acknowledge their pain. They understand that the narcissist's inability to love was never a reflection of their worth, but of the narcissist's limitation. And once this truth is fully embodied, there is nothing left to say. This silence is not empty, it's full of resolve. Every step away from the narcissist is a step toward freedom. And while the narcissist may attempt to provoke, to hoover, to remind the empath of shared history or imagined loyalty, none of it lands anymore. The empath sees through the tactics. The guilt no longer works. The charm is no longer convincing. The manipulation, once so effective, now looks obvious and desperate. And what once felt like love is now clearly seen as control. The narcissist may spin narratives, play the victim, or rally others to question the empath's character. But even that has no power when the empath no longer plays the game. When they walk away without responding, without defending themselves, they choose peace over perception. They understand that no amount of justification will satisfy the narcissist's need for dominance, and in refusing to participate in the performance, they end it. Not with a dramatic curtain drop, but with the quiet strength of someone who knows their worth. To the outside world, it might seem sudden, but for the empath, this departure is the result of countless moments of betrayal, of swallowed pain, of overlooked red flags. It's the culmination of years of internal conflict, of trying to make it work, of hoping for change. And when that final line is crossed, the decision is already made. There is no anger left, only certainty. This kind of silence is deafening to the narcissist. It reflects a kind of power they do not understand. A power that does not scream, does not chase, does not beg. It simply exits and never looks back. And in that exit, the empath is reborn. They are no longer the person who once endured, who once tolerated, who once explained. They are someone new, someone whole, someone free, someone who finally knows that walking away is not weakness, but the highest form of strength.
And that was Jordan Peterson. Back in a minute. Thank you, and this is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that materialism is a concept.